What you're looking at right now used to be a column, 40 combat vehicles, 320 men. On paper, this was supposed to be Russia's answer, one heavy strike to finally punch through the line. In reality, it was already a disaster before a single Russian boot crossed the start line. Within the hour, 29 vehicles were burning wrecks scattered across the steppe, 140 men were dead. And when the smoke cleared, the front line hadn't moved. Not one position changed hands. For 1,500 days, the Russian army has been storming Tokmachka and losing up to 1,500 soldiers every single day, killed, wounded, and simply gone. And this is not even a town. A few streets, a handful of destroyed houses, but a Ukrainian brigade, trained by NATO instructors, is still holding it. The Russians keep sending in tank columns and assault groups. Hundreds of drones circle overhead every single day. Artillery never stops firing, but the front line hasn't moved even a kilometer. The siege of Tokmachka is one of the longest in modern history, longer than the siege of Sarajevo. Russia has lost more armored vehicles here than entire countries like the Netherlands even own. All of this for a village that is 10 kilometers long and 500 meters wide. How did the Ukrainians turn a pile of destroyed houses into a fortress that is grinding down one of the largest armies in the world? Why are Russians dying for this village? Why does Tokmachka matter? And why did the last massive tank assault of this war happen right here? That's exactly what this video is about. So it all started in 2022, when the Russian army suddenly pushed north from Crimea into southern Ukraine. According to Ukraine's general staff, the Russian numerical advantage on this axis reached 15-1. A Ukrainian retreat was inevitable. Otherwise, significant forces would have been encircled. Within days, Russian columns were already sitting on the outskirts of Tokmachka. Their scouts could already see the factory smokestacks of Zaporizhzhia. A thriving southern Ukrainian village with a population of around 3,000 became the front line. Among its notable features, a large prison complex, which we'll come back to later in this video. But the Russian army could not push any further. Why? The thing is, the Russians had just covered 250 kilometers. Behind them, enemy territory, so their logistics were already under threat. Ahead of them, Orikhiv, where civilians were mixing Molotov cocktails right there in the streets. But the main threat was Ukrainian artillery units that had managed to move up and bring the approaches to the village under fire control. The Russians realized they were in a trap. Look at the map. Tokmachka sits in a narrow strip of lowland surrounded by hills. Basically, a pit. Where the Russians had been advancing across flat, open steppe before, the terrain here made it impossible to exploit their numerical advantage. In fact, there's simply nowhere to hide large amounts of equipment, so things got hard for the Russians fast. Under the pressure of artillery and Ukrainian counterattacks, they pulled back, but only by about 6,000 paces, the distance a person walks in 15 minutes. Month after month, the Russians ground down the Ukrainian defense. Tokmachka appeared in battlefield reports hundreds of times and was reduced to rubble. All that was left of the village were walls and basements. Over the following year, the Russians crept forward again toward the village, but only by about 3,000 paces. Then, in the summer of 2023, everything changed, just not in the way anyone expected. By that point, Ukraine had received hundreds of pieces of Western equipment from its allies. American M109 self-propelled howitzers, M113 APCs, Bradley and Stryker, German Leopard 2 tanks in various variants, and Marder IFVs. Ukrainian brigades went through intensive training at NATO ranges. The US, the UK, and Ukraine ran a series of classified command staff war games at a US base in Germany. The goal: break through to the Sea of Azov, cover 250 kilometers, and cut the land corridor between Russia and Crimea. Tokmachka was right at the center of those plans. The village became the staging area for equipment and personnel for the decisive push. But Ukrainian units barely covered 10 kilometers. What went wrong? The Russians had turned the southern front into the largest defensive system in Europe since World War II. Thousands of mines, anti-tank ditches, concrete fortifications, and dozens of kilometers of trenches stretched across open, flat steppe. Nothing gets through undetected, not even a mouse. This defensive system was named the Surovikin Line, after the commander of Russian forces on this axis. But it turned out that wasn't even the main problem. Russian reconnaissance drones were tracking every movement of Ukrainian equipment 24/7, from kilometers before the front line. So the Ukrainians were expected. The tanks and IFVs meant to punch through the Surovikin Line became easy targets for cheap FPVs before they even got close. Ukrainian artillery was spotted from the air and immediately targeted by Lancets or Krasnopol rounds. And when the first line was breached, Russian artillery and Ka-52 and Mi-28 helicopters took over. The result? Instead of a fast breakout to the Sea of Azov, the Ukrainians clawed out a small patch of ground, roughly 10 by 10 kilometers. And then Ukrainian command was forced to stop large-scale tank attacks to preserve personnel and equipment. It would take another 2.5 years before Ukrainian command found a way to actually reach the Sea of Azov. More on that later, but the failed counteroffensive isn't the main takeaway. From that point on, it became clear that the fog of war had lifted and the battlefield was fully transparent. Before this counteroffensive, only Ukrainian generals understood that. Afterwards, so did NATO generals who had still believed in the armored fist. For some reason, though, Russian generals didn't get the memo, which is honestly strange because they were attacking the exact same way and losing equipment the exact same way the Ukrainians did. This went on until the Russians ran out of tanks on this axis. Before we get to the last tank assault of this war and explain why Tokmachka matters,
please subscribe to the Weapons of Victory channel and don't forget to leave a comment.
So, in the spring of 2025, Russian command decided to break through the Ukrainian defense with a heavy strike, right along the same route the Ukrainian counteroffensive used in 2023. They sent in 320 fighters, plus 40 vehicles, but Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance spotted the enemy's advance early. The first Russian vehicle was hit approximately 8 kilometers from Tokmachka, meaning the plan started falling apart before the assault even began. After that, Russian convoys came under artillery and drone strikes. Within an hour, it was clear that the breakthrough had turned into a fight for survival. The result? 29 vehicles destroyed, 140 killed or missing, and not a single position taken. The outcome was predictable, because over 1,500 days of fighting around Tokmachka, the tactics of this war have changed completely. The front line, where the two sides' positions were once separated by about 3,000 paces, has become a belt more than 10 kilometers wide. Tanks have no business showing up here. Command posts and communications nodes have moved 4 to 6 meters underground, 15 to 20 kilometers behind the front, and units are managed through live drone feeds. Artillery pieces are hidden in deep revetments, wrapped in metal mesh nets, and covered with special camouflage netting that reduces their thermal signature. Logistics no longer run by truck because that's suicide. Food, water, and ammunition are delivered by heavy hexacopter drones or ground-based tracked and wheeled robotic platforms. But the Russians keep storming Tokmachka on foot. Instead of companies and convoys, they move in pairs of 2 soldiers, one pair following another with a 30-minute gap between them. They crawl through tree lines, craters, and old trenches toward the staging point, the basement of the prison complex. While the Ukrainians destroy the first pair, the second is already creeping forward. And here is the key question of this video. Why do the Russians want Tokmachka? Not for the ruins, obviously. The Russians are trying to reach Orikhiv, the main fortress of the southern front, and open a direct path toward the major city of Zaporizhzhia. That is why assault operations here never stop. Not for a single moment. For the Ukrainians, Tokmachka is also not just rubble. It is a laboratory where a new kind of war was born. The Ukrainians are holding Tokmachka in order to do what they failed to do in 2023. Cut the land corridor between Russia and Crimea. How is that even possible from 250 kilometers away? Look, using drones like the Hornet, Ukraine has turned the main highway between Russia and Crimea into a highway of death. It looks like the Ukrainians have drawn the right lessons from their failed counteroffensive. While Russians crawl toward their deaths around the clock, Ukrainian drones hunt fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, and rail hubs around the clock. The Hornet's flight time to target is about 1 hour. Maximum range is 300 kilometers. That's enough to make sure no convoy feels safe anywhere. Ukrainian fighters say the war changes every day. You can feel it even after a week of leave. But it seems like the mid-strike tactic is yet another invention born from this war. Write in the comments whether you'd want to see a separate video about this tactic and the drones the Ukrainians are using. And in these playlists, you'll find videos about other operations of this war, from the defense of Kyiv to the trap at Kupiansk. Stay safe. Support Ukraine.